They ruled the world without borders, armies, or flags. Their empire built not on nations, but on fear, loyalty, and blood. The Mafia Kings weren't just gangsters. They were masterminds who turned crime into an international business. From the dusty streets of Sicily to the glittering lights of New York, their influence stretched across oceans, governments, and generations. They controlled politicians, ran billion-dollar rackets, and made the law bow before them. Every deal, every death, every silence was part of a code, omerta, that no one dared to break. This isn't just a story about criminals. It's a story about power, pure, ruthless power. Welcome to the untold history of how crime ruled the world, and how a few men in the shadows became the true kings of the underworld. It all began in the rugged hills and sunburned villages of Sicily, long before the world had even heard the word mafia. The island was a place of beauty and blood, where the poor were crushed under corrupt landlords, foreign rulers, and a government that never cared for them. In those days, protection didn't come from the law. It came from men. Men who were feared, respected, and obeyed. They called themselves men of honor, or uomini d'onore. At first, their purpose seemed noble. They defended farmers from bandits and merchants from thieves. They became a shadow government, offering justice where the real one failed. But power has a way of corrupting even the purest cause. What started as protection soon became control. The protectors became the predators, and the people of Sicily found themselves under a new kind of rule, a silent one, built on threats and obedience. The mafia was born out of secrecy and silence, bound by an ancient code known as omerta. Under this code, no one could speak to outsiders about the affairs of the brotherhood. Betrayal meant death, not just for the traitor, but for anyone who stood too close. Loyalty was sacred, and revenge was swift. Within this system, family and crime became one. Power flowed through bloodlines, and violence became a tool of discipline. Every favor demanded another favor. Every debt, another promise. Over time, the mafia evolved from a loose group of enforcers into an organized network, united by shared symbols and rituals. New members swore oaths before the saints, promising allegiance unto death. The mafia was no longer just an idea. It was an institution. By the late 1800s, these so-called men of honor had begun to infiltrate every corner of Sicilian life. They controlled land disputes, trade routes, and even elections. Politicians needed their blessing, and business owners paid for their protection. The mafia learned to work not against the system, but inside it, feeding off corruption, using power to buy influence, and influence to gain more power. It was a cycle of control that made them unstoppable. While the police chased small-time thieves, the mafia moved silently in the background, deciding who lived, who prospered, and who disappeared. Then came a turning point. As Italy modernized and many Sicilians fled poverty for the New World, the mafia saw an opportunity to expand its reach. Thousands of Italian immigrants arrived in America, carrying with them the customs, traditions, and hidden loyalties of their homeland. Among them were men who had sworn the oath, men who would rebuild the brotherhood across the ocean. But in Sicily, the mafia's roots only grew deeper. Wars between rival clans spilled blood into the streets, and entire towns lived under fear. By the early 20th century, the mafia had become more than a criminal organization. It was a way of life. It thrived on secrecy, on the unspoken agreement between power and silence. The Italian government tried to crush it, sending generals and soldiers to restore order, but no force could destroy what lived in the shadows. The mafia didn't need to fight openly. It only needed to wait, to bribe, to threaten, to survive. And survive it did, stronger than ever. As the world changed and the modern age dawned, The mafia's ambitions began to outgrow Sicily. The island was too small, too poor, and too known. Across the Atlantic lay a land of opportunity, America, a place where money flowed, the law was young, and the streets were hungry for power. The Sicilian Brotherhood saw what was coming. Their empire had been born in blood and silence. Now it was ready to spread across the world. The mafia was about to evolve from a local secret society into the most powerful criminal force the modern world had ever seen. When the first Sicilian immigrants arrived in America, they came with nothing but hope, and the hidden codes of a world they left behind. In the crowded neighborhoods of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, they found poverty, discrimination, and lawlessness. It was a perfect breeding ground for something dark and familiar. Among the thousands seeking honest work were men who carried with them the traditions of the old country, respect, loyalty, and the silent power of Cosa Nostra. These men realized that in America, power didn't belong to kings or soldiers. It belonged to those who could control money, fear, and opportunity. The mafia had crossed the ocean, and it was about to reinvent itself on American soil. At first, these immigrants stuck together for survival. They created small protection groups to defend themselves from rival gangs and corrupt officials. But soon, those groups began fighting for territory, money, and dominance. In the 1910s and early 1920s, as America's cities grew, so did its underworld. The Italian gangs battled the Irish and the Jewish mobs for control of gambling, extortion, and prostitution. Yet the real turning point came in 1920, when the United States made one of the biggest mistakes in its history: Prohibition. By banning alcohol, the government unknowingly handed the mafia a golden empire. Overnight, ordinary men became millionaires. Bootlegging, illegal liquor smuggling, transformed street gangs into vast organizations. The mafia saw business where others saw risk. They controlled distilleries, warehouses, and speakeasies, moving rivers of liquor across the nation. Money flowed faster than anyone could count, and with it came influence. Politicians, police officers, and judges all had their price. The mafia paid them well. Violence became a tool of business, not just survival. Those who refused to cooperate were silenced permanently. In this new America, one man stood above all: Charles Lucky Luciano. A visionary in a world of thugs, Luciano changed the mafia forever. He realized that endless bloodshed between families weakened everyone. So, in 1931, after orchestrating the infamous Castellamarese war between rival bosses, he created something revolutionary: the Commission. It was a national council that united the mafia families across the United States. Each major city had its family, and all were represented on the Commission, ensuring peace, cooperation, and profit. Luciano turned the mafia from a chaotic gang war into a structured criminal corporation. Under this system, the mafia thrived. Cities like Chicago had Al Capone, the ruthless king of bootlegging, whose empire generated millions weekly. In New York, families like the Genovese, Gambino, and Lucchese clans became invisible monarchs of power. They infiltrated unions, construction companies, and shipping industries, making crime indistinguishable from business. With every dollar that passed through their hands, their control deepened. America's underworld had become an organized shadow government. But what made the mafia truly powerful wasn't just their guns or their money. It was their silence. The sacred code of Omerta followed them across the ocean. No one talked. No one betrayed. Even in prison, their loyalty remained unbroken. To the outside world, they were faceless, nameless men. But inside their world, they lived by rules stricter than any law. Respect your boss, protect your family, never speak to outsiders, and never forgive betrayal. By the end of Prohibition in 1933, the mafia had embedded itself deep into the fabric of American life. The repeal of the alcohol ban didn't weaken them. It only forced them to evolve. They expanded into narcotics, gambling, labor unions, and real estate. Every industry that touched money eventually felt their shadow. The American dream had two sides, one built on hard work and the other on crime. The Mafia, now richer and stronger than ever, stood at the center of it all. From the poor immigrants who once begged for survival, they had risen to become the kings of America's underworld, ruling not through law but through fear, loyalty, and power that stretched from city halls to the darkest alleys. By the 1950s, the Mafia had grown into a vast and invisible empire. The war-torn world was rebuilding, but in America, the real architects of power weren't always politicians or businessmen. They were the Mafia Kings who controlled the pulse of the nation from smoke-filled backrooms. The five families of New York, Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, ruled the underworld like royal dynasties. Each family had its boss, its soldiers, its code, and its fortune. Together, they decided who lived, who died, and who got rich. From the docks to the construction sites, from the unions to Las Vegas casinos, everything that made money had the Mafia's fingerprints on it. They had turned organized crime into an empire that rivaled the wealth of legitimate corporations. The Mafia's influence wasn't just in crime. It had crept into politics, entertainment, and even international finance. They fixed elections, controlled labor unions, and negotiated deals with corrupt businessmen who feared them more than they feared the law. With the help of clever minds like Meyer Lansky, the so-called mob accountant, the Mafia found ways to hide millions through offshore accounts and casinos in Havana and Las Vegas. Lansky, a Jewish mobster allied with Lucky Luciano, turned organized crime into a global enterprise. The Mafia no longer operated from the shadows of alleyways. It now moved through the glimmering lights of hotels, nightclubs, and casinos. Their wealth was clean on paper, but dirty in every sense of the word. In Las Vegas, a new kind of empire was rising. The Mafia funded hotels and casinos, using front men to make it all look legitimate. Behind the glamour, money was skimmed from every table, every slot machine, and every showgirl's paycheck. Millions of untaxed dollars were funneled back to Mafia bosses in New York, Chicago, and Kansas City. It was the perfect business. No receipts, no witnesses, and no mercy. The mob built Las Vegas as the world saw it, a playground of luxury and sin. Yet, behind every neon light was a dark shadow, a reminder that nothing in Vegas came without a price. Meanwhile, the Mafia's reach extended across oceans. In Italy, Cosa Nostra maintained close ties with its American cousins, trafficking drugs through ports in Sicily. Heroin, known as white powder gold, became one of the Mafia's most profitable ventures. Using international networks, they shipped drugs from the Middle East into Europe, and from there to America. The profits were staggering. The Mafia had become a global corporation of crime, structured, disciplined, and ruthless. But with power came arrogance. And arrogance brought attention. By the 1960s, the U.S. government could no longer ignore what had become a state within a state. The Mafia's silence, its omerta, kept law enforcement blind for decades, but cracks began to show. Wiretaps, undercover agents, and new investigative techniques started to reveal the truth. Yet, even as authorities hunted them, the Mafia's influence reached high into government offices and police departments. Many investigations simply vanished, silenced by bribes or threats. Still, public awareness was growing. Newspapers began exposing the names of bosses once thought untouchable, and television showed America that the Mafia wasn't fiction. It was real. And it was. The fall of the Mafia Kings didn't happen overnight. It was slow, bloody, and inevitable. By the 1970s, the golden age of organized crime was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own greed. The empire that once ruled cities and countries was now cracking from within. Betrayal, ambition, and arrogance began to eat away at the code that had kept the Mafia untouchable for decades. The sacred oath of omerta, the law of silence, was no longer absolute. Men who once swore to die for the family began to talk, to the press, to the police, and to the FBI. The mafia, which had survived wars and governments, now faced a new kind of enemy, its own members. The first major blow came in 1963, when Joseph Valachi, a low-ranking soldier in the Genovese family, broke the code and testified before the U.S. Senate. For the first time in history, the world heard the word mafia spoken openly by one of its own. Valachi described the structure, rituals, and crimes of Cosa Nostra in shocking detail. The government, which had long denied the mafia's existence, could no longer look away. His testimony gave law enforcement a blueprint, a way to understand and infiltrate the organization from the inside. What had once been a ghost in the shadows was now a target in the light. As the FBI expanded its operations, wiretaps, undercover agents, and surveillance began to expose the underworld like never before. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, became the government's most powerful weapon. It allowed prosecutors to go after entire crime families, not just individual members. For the first time, the bosses themselves were vulnerable. Men who had given orders for decades, never touching the crimes themselves, could now be held responsible for everything done in their name. The old ways no longer worked. The mafia's untouchable image began to crumble. In New York, the powerful Gambino crime family faced its own civil war. When boss Paul Castellano was assassinated outside Sparks Steakhouse in 1985, the underworld trembled. His killer, John Gotti, became both a media sensation and a symbol of the mafia's defiance. The press called him the Dapper Don, charming, stylish, and ruthless. But his fame was also his downfall. Gotti's arrogance brought constant attention, and the FBI made him their top target. Years later, wiretaps recorded his every move, and his underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, turned government witness. The man who had once embodied the mafia's glory was now destroyed by the same code he broke. Across America, similar stories unfolded. The Bonanno family disintegrated after years of infighting. The Lucchese and Colombo families faced endless betrayals. Informants became common, and loyalty, once sacred, turned into a bargaining chip for lighter sentences. Old bosses were dying, new ones were reckless, and the streets no longer respected the old traditions. The mafia's enemies weren't just the FBI or rival gangs anymore. They were time, technology, and change. By the 1990s, law enforcement had won the war that once seemed impossible. The Commission, the governing body Lucky Luciano had created to keep order among the families, was gone. Dozens of bosses were serving life sentences, and the mafia's control over unions, casinos, and the drug trade was shattered. What remained was a ghost of its former self, scattered across small crews and fading territories. The Mafia Kings who once ruled through fear and silence were now relics of another era. Their fall wasn't just the end of a criminal dynasty, it was the death of a code, a culture, and a way of life that had defined organized crime for more than a century. The world had changed, and for the first time, crime no longer ruled it. Even after the headlines faded and the mafia's power crumbled, the legend of the Mafia Kings refused to die. Their reign had left deep scars on history, and a blueprint for power that still shapes the criminal world today. Though the great families of New York lost their crowns, the system they built didn't vanish. It evolved. In Italy, Cosa Nostra still operated in silence, while new syndicates like the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria and the Camorra in Naples rose to global dominance. These groups learned from the mistakes of their American cousins, staying low, quiet, and invisible. They no longer sought fame or glamour. Instead, they embraced secrecy, laundering billions through banks, fake businesses, and international trade. The mafia's empire had simply changed its face, from bullets and blood to suits and spreadsheets. In America, the mafia's influence lingered like smoke. Even as the FBI declared victory, small crews continued to run gambling rings, loan sharking operations, and construction rackets. The old code was weakened, but not forgotten. In neighborhoods across New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, whispers of the life still carried a strange kind of respect. Younger generations didn't fear the mafia as their fathers did, but they still admired its myth, the idea of loyalty, respect, and brotherhood in a corrupt world. That myth, polished by decades of films and stories, became the mafia's most powerful weapon of all. Hollywood turned the underworld into legend. Movies like The Godfather, Goodfellas, and The Irishman turned real gangsters into cultural icons. People no longer saw them as murderers or extortionists, but as tragic anti-heroes, men bound by loyalty, family, and honor. The irony was sharp. The same organization that once hid from cameras now lived forever on screen. The world's fascination with the mafia kept its spirit alive, even as its real-life influence declined. Every film, every quote, every romanticized scene reminded people of a time when the mafia ruled the streets like kings. But behind the legend was still the truth, a story of greed, betrayal, and death. Globally, the mafia's legacy inspired others. From the Russian bratva to the Mexican cartels, organized crime learned from the old Sicilian ways. The same structure, bosses, underbosses, soldiers, and enforcers, could be found in every continent. Even in the digital age, cybercrime networks adopted mafia-style organization. Loyalty, hierarchy, and fear remained the foundation of power. The mafia's shadow stretched into modern times, no longer bound to cities or guns, but to data, fraud, and technology. The underworld had gone digital, but its soul remained the same. Yet despite all the evolution, the mafia's decline carried a sense of tragedy. For decades, they had controlled nations and built empires. But the very values that made them powerful, loyalty, pride, secrecy, became their downfall. One betrayal at a time, the foundation cracked. Friends turned informants, families broke apart, and the silence that once protected them became a prison of their own making. By the 2000s, the great mafia families were history, their bosses dead, imprisoned, or forgotten. Still, in the dim light of memory, their names echo. Luciano, Gotti, Lansky, Capone. Kings without crowns, who changed the course of crime forever. They taught the world that power isn't always worn openly. Sometimes, it hides in whispers, in money, and in fear. The Mafia Kings ruled their world through loyalty and blood, and though their empires have turned to dust, their legend endures. A chilling reminder that crime, once it tastes power, never truly dies. The Mafia may have fallen, but its ghost still walks among us, in the corridors of business, politics, and power, forever reminding the world of how crime once ruled it.